Let's welcome in now Guadalupe. Is it Guadalupe or Guadalupe's?
Guadalupe.
Guadalupe. And if you haven't been listening to the morning ones, what we do is I say a quick welcome and let you give your own bio. I feel that works better for our audience, and then just jump right in over here. So we'll turn the stage to you.
Okay, sounds great.
Please go ahead.
Sounds good. So my name is Guadalupe Hayes-Mota, and I'm the Director of Global Supply Chain at Ultragenics, and I deal with clinical supply chains. And my experience has been a broad range of working in different biotech companies, from Biogen to GSK and now Ultragenics. I've also have worked in actually managing healthcare clinics myself as a director of ambulatory clinics, but also I have worked in healthcare policy, working at the Brand Corporation, doing the Affordable Care Act. So my experience has been really specific right now, really kind of thinking about gene therapies and how to really make sure those are accessible within clinical trials around the globe. And so for today's presentation, I really want to focus on how do we actually managing the supply chains now with COVID-19 times, right? There's a lot of different changes that are happening, and there's a lot of impact that a lot of supply chains being impacted within clinics. And so this has, I'm sure, has impacted every company that is out there doing that. So to give you a perspective of exactly how the COVID-19 impact in supply chain has been, there has been studies showing that about 95% of the Fortune 1000 companies are seeing supply chain disruption from COVID-19. And this means their commercial, but also their product-based development, and then this includes clinical trials. So this being really impacting a lot of the companies of how they're being conducting this. Also, 75% of companies have had a negative or strongly negative impact on their businesses. That means a lot of the selling, but also development of the product. So this means that the supply chains are really being disrupted right now, and there has to be ways of thinking of how do we make sure that we are prepared in case something else happens in the future. And now 55% of companies plan to downgrade their growth outlook. So that means they're trying to decrease this, and this implies within the supply chains because of the disruption of COVID-19. So we can all agree that COVID-19 has really disrupted the way that we do business and really the way that we kind of manage supply chains, and really coming when before we didn't think about this as a risk and being a big impact. So when we think about the risk that has happened or how supply chains have been impacted by COVID-19, there has to be impacted on like 4 dimensions when we look at supply chain specific clinically. This has been the manufacturing of it, has been the logistics of it, the procurement, and the supply chain planning. So to dive in a little bit more about the manufacturing, a lot of the manufacturing, the impact that COVID-19 has had specifically in clinical supply is really the ability to think about how we're going to be able to produce this product and transforming the operations that are happening in the really day-to-day within the actual manufacturing places, because now there is restrictions about who actually can access this, what exactly the protocols are. So it's much more constrained, and if we would not be able to manufacture something, obviously that delays a lot of the patients getting their medicines. Within manufacturing also is the ability to get those specific primary sources or primary materials to really start the manufacturing. So those questions came up. A lot of this, we kind of faced this at the beginning when a lot of the supply chains start thinking we're getting a lot of the supplies from China and the primary resources coming in. So there was a thinking that will impact the manufacturing, which in some cases it did, in some cases it didn't. So that's how that has impacted manufacturing itself. Now, thinking about logistically, what exactly logistically is being impacted now with COVID-19, and this involves a lot within the actual transportation of these products who we're sending to, and the regulations that go within this specific transportation. And there's been at the beginning, there were some closures specifically from specific parts of the world. So that kind of impacted where those products was going to and really how to really get those products to the patient. So logistically, there was a lot of different constraints there in how to actually make sure transportation-wise the patient got that. So that was really a big influence in how we were doing this. Now, a little thinking about the procurement side of influence, there has been how do we source the specific products, from the primary sourcing of it to really sourcing other materials to ancillary supplies. And this has been some big changes because there were some ancillary supplies that you might need for specifically treating COVID-19 now actually needed for other clinical trials. So getting that sourcing was really important. And so there was some barriers of really just getting the basics of the sourcing of this. And the procurement was a difficulty of really getting those specifics into the supply chain. And lastly, but not to think about this, has been pretty much the planning of supply chain. And what I mean by the planning is really thinking how we're going to meet the demand with the supply. And this involves a lot of understanding how do we actually get this product through the end-to-end supply chain to get it to the actual patient, and planning about how much demand do we need of all of these different components. How it's very difficult because now it's a different situation about COVID-19, a new scenario that was a black swan that really we haven't faced in the past. And so this itself really introduced a new problem of how do we actually start meeting that demand and really making sure we are providing those. So overall, the COVID-19 impacted supply chains in all these 4 dimensions in a really heavy way. So we were not really prepared to really thinking about how do we do this. Now, the question that I really want to address through this in the next things is thinking about how do you think about managing that supply chain to really think about problems that do come up, like in these cases. And this is where we come up and start thinking in this kind of how do you manage the 4 challenges. And these challenges that you do is you think of it in 4 kind of steps in the way that we address it, Ultragenics, but also how we address it in general to start thinking how do we come up with these really difficult problems and start thinking of how to provide the patient. The first thing that you have to do in thinking of this model of operations is really first start creating a sense. So start thinking of sensing, and where you start thinking of the risk that you will be facing within the implications of any type of risk that you're facing. In this case will be the COVID-19 introduction. And really thinking about the components and the ecosystems of how it is at the current moment and where you want it to go. So getting that sense as your first step to really start managing that supply chain. Stepping into, once you get a sense of just the basis of it, start analyzing where your supply chain is specifically in the clinical space. And that is where you start thinking about what if scenarios. What exactly would happen if you do this or you do that? And thinking about protocols for sourcing, plan, make, distribution, and thinking the alternates of really what will look like the possible solution to this, and really start analyzing those different configurations to make sure you're riding in the right direction. And the third step is to configure. In this case, you get all this, whatever you have sensed, whatever you analyze, you configure to tailor network and really your product flows to secure the new protocols that you have addressed, and really start changing exactly what those risks and those risk mitigations to make sure your new supply chain strategy is getting towards that direction of being able to meet the demand. And just develop a source of tracking for that, really how to do that. And the very last step that you want to do within this model that really helps thinking about your supply chains is mobilizing. Now that you have configured and thinking about exactly how it's going to do, is now to really start doing a response plan where you utilize this and you kind of put it back into established operating rules that will be helpful for your supply chain. And you kind of go through this iteration of these steps over and over to really get a robust supply chain and make sure it's fine. So now this is when a framework of thinking how do you really cope with any risk that you go through, and in this case, the COVID-19. And so thinking in each of those steps, we can think about first, right away when the COVID-19 started, we first wanted to sense exactly what the problems were and really start thinking what exactly is going around and understand the ecosystems and where our supply chains. The second thing when we actually start analyzing is we really look at the supply chains within COVID-19 and see what would happen if we start sourcing for specific places, what would happen if we start manufacturing from these places, and what would happen if we actually did supply planning a different way. So that analyzation really help us to move forward. And then that kind of led us to configure that we really wanted to get secondary sourcing, or we wanted to think about how to do the planning differently. That configured the entire change of it. And then we led to the mobilization of really getting these challenges addressed. Now, for the next parts of my presentation, what I really want to dive into is just thinking about how do you kind of mitigate those risks, or how do you help in those 4 areas that I talked about, which was, manufacturing, logistics, procurement, and planning. So to look at that, I'm going to dive first into thinking about the manufacturing actions that can be addressed in COVID-19 within a supply chain, specific and clinical, to make sure your manufacturing is in the right pace and really making sure it's providing that production that you need. And first is one of the things you have to look at is kind of understand the impact of the demand disruptions. So really, when the COVID-19 started, even now, is really rapidly identify the products, in this case, your clinical products, that are the most critical for stabilization and growth. So thinking about what clinical trials are your priorities, and kind of sort up and associate supply chains and reconcile critical skills to meet terms and future demand. So really start thinking about what are these demand disruptions going to influence, and prioritizing those that really need what you need to focus on. Second thing you have to do is kind of manage your workforce safely and flexibly. So one of the things with manufacturing is that you heavily depend on people to make your products. And in order for us to safely create these products, you have to make sure that your trust for your workforce is addressing any physical safety. In this case, they have to be tested, and they have to actually go get different vaccines or ability to help them to get to the work. And also kind of helping address their mental well-being and need to stay connected with coworkers. So giving that space for your workforce is really important, because if you keep a healthy workforce, you're going to be able to be producing this product in the long term. And third thing is to ensure manufacturing ecosystems viability. So pretty much here is when you want to understand the implications of COVID-19 and kind of contract provisions for each critical ecosystem player. And this means like, what is your material suppliers, your contract companies, your co-manufacturers, your logistics providers. So your manufacturers should start thinking about what exactly those connections are and start really diving into what those changes are. And the fourth thing is kind of rebalancing physical production network assets. So here is where you want to make fast and accurate decisions on, the capital investment or efforts required to deploy underutilizations assets. So kind of be able to think about where you're going to put your physical production network assets to really start meeting that demand, and start thinking within your manufacturing manufacturing network where you're going to put those assets, and really thinking short term to make sure you're meeting those clinical demands, but also making sure that you don't inhibit the future growth of other clinical trials coming in the pipeline. So making sure you really rebalance what exactly the priorities are, and for kind of setting those assets that you have. And the fifth of this is kind of leverage digital capabilities. So here, think about manufacturing platforms that are digital that you can really utilize to think about the capabilities and really utilize that to quickly respond to any changes that are happening with your clinical trial, and really the demands are happening within different parts of the world. So making sure you are leveraging that digital capabilities in your manufacturing can really help you start setting success. So if you kind of install this kind of 5 different perspectives within manufacturing, this can really address some of the COVID-19 risk and mitigate those to make sure you do kind of have that manufacturing on play and ready to go to provide to the patients. Now, the next stage that I want to talk about is logistics, right? So logistics, as I talked earlier, has been impacted with the way of transportation, has been impacted with the regulations. And there's 4 ways that we can think about how do we actually address the actions with COVID-19 to really mitigate this in logistics. The first thing is to improve visibility. So one of the most important things is really having that visibility from all of supply chain operations, and that visibility can be translated also within clinical operations, where we get the visibility of the demands, get the visibility of the timing, get visibility of how these things will work, but also the visibility of when products will be ready and moving to the next stage. So having that really strong visibility within the different parts, it's really important, because if you don't have that visibility, it's kind of hard to move a product forward within the logistical space. Secondly, you want to increase flexibility. So here in flexibility, you want to think about how you're going to repurpose assets. In this case, thinking about how you're going to utilize your distributors, how are you going to work with individuals that are working in logisticals, thinking about how you can utilize that flexibility within what you have to work with and the capabilities, and to be able to demand supply and demand. And sometimes this can be creative and where you are thinking about who is doing the work and how that work is going to be managed. So just be very flexible how you can be doing that. And the third, it kind of goes back to my point earlier on, which is communicate effectively. So to ensure communication happens, logistically requires so many different stakeholders within that you need to be thinking about how this communication that happens on site within your distributors and your remote workers, your suppliers, your carriers, your patients, all of that kind of stays connected. So you have to be able to have that communications. And this is one of our key important players. The clinical operations team can really kind of help and have that conversations of when these specific things are needed and how to do that. And the fourth thing that can happen with the logistics is really just support the workforce. So in here, address any physical health and well-being of your core workforce that is doing the logistics, as well as the workforce that's doing on-site within the distribution, making sure they're being taken care of and really taking care of what exactly doing with the distributions, because if you don't have that workforce ready and healthy, you're not going to be able to really distribute these products around for the patients. So like I said, these four major things are great ways to really address this COVID-19 is like improve your visibility, increase flexibility, communicate effectively, and support the workforce will really kind of help you think about the logistical changes. Now I want to talk a little about procurement. So procurement is one of those things that really, like I talked earlier, has been really impacted within COVID-19, because early on, we thought a lot of like the free raw materials that we're going to get into manufacturing, and later on, we're going to be limited because obviously there was some delays in production, let's say in China or in other parts of the world. And so that was going to be a down the domino effect that we would be getting at. So this was one of the first questions that we addressed in thinking about how do we think about thinking of the procurement that we're doing for our supply chains to make sure is robust in order to address this COVID-19. And the first thing to think about this is put people first. So what I mean by this is kind of develop a digital-driven procurement operating model in new ways, with ways of working with internal customers, but also supplier ecosystems, so in external partners. So start creating those really relationships with external partners that really will provide this and have leveraging that information, have the demand and providing that together.
You're taking her out?
So, and then really thinking of securing the supply.
I have 2 minutes. My sister wants to come up.
Manage and mitigate supply chain uncertainty with suppliers of all prices. So just really thinking about the supply chain base. Third, we can unlock funds and tendencies. So think about how you are going to responsible interventions to minimize spending and convert cash flow initiatives. So thinking about how you're going to utilize these funds and investing within those procurements. And fourth, build resilience for the future. So in this case, really think about your risk management strategies to ensure resilience, purposeful-led procurement decisions. So making sure that you are building for the future, for making those decisions in the future and having those connections within suppliers. And the fifth is innovate with purpose. So in this case, take purpose-led innovations to kind of let greater trust, transparency, customer interest, centricity, and innovate with economy's balance. So really just start thinking about how you can change the procurement system and having those communications with your suppliers. That really gives you a strong way for that. Now, the last part that I'll be talking is talking about the supply chain and planning with this gives you like a sense of what exactly are their ways to address the planning, and this involves where a lot of demand planning to really satisfy supply. And so, like I said early on, for this, we have to put people first. So you have to keep your workforce healthy, of your supply chain management, who's doing the planning, and really thinking about how you can really provide that support for them. Because if you don't have that workforce ready to go and really helping you, it's hard to really innovate and change. The second thing is leverage data to improve visibility. So one of the important things, like I said early on, is that visibility with supply chain to make sure that kind of moves along and gets to the patient. And so when we want to be able to kind of minimize the demand, the inventory, capacity, supply, and find us across the ecosystem of supply. So really kind of improving that visibility, what's going on of the demand within your supply chain really kind of helps you thinking of what the demand and supply would happen. And really, the third thing is define segmentation to prioritize demand. So in here, think about what clinical trials are more important to you and how you're going to segment the priorities of those things so you're able to be disseminate that demand over other things and accordingly giving that supply. And evaluate supply scenarios. So here, think about what the scenario will be and how do those look. And definitely innovate with purpose as before. So here's like innovate again, thinking about what you want to achieve and how you're going to do that with the plan. So overall, as I talk to this thing, I can address 4 different ways of kind of thinking of COVID-19 and give you a framework of thinking of that. So with that, I just end this conversation and just, I don't know if there's any questions or anything that people want to say.
Hi, Guadalupe. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm looking in the question queue, and it's fairly light at this point. You never want to be the last speaker between the presentation and lunch, so I'm guessing that that might be some of the focus, or maybe some people have already started and they're at the round table and so forth. But I do appreciate the fact that you laid out a lot of the pragmatic considerations for what's needed, in the environment today. And I would encourage folks to learn from someone that's facing these situations or has faced these situations, and making sure that there is continuity. We've heard of all those problems in the full supply chain, and you've told us about some considerations for now and what you can do in the future. Right.
Well, thank you so much. It's been
okay. Thank you as well. I'm going to turn it back over to Sam then for logistics now over the lunch break.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lin. So, as you mentioned, we will be having a break from 12:35 now until 1:05 p.m. We'll be starting our afternoon sessions with Dr. Om Sharma. He'll be speaking about strides in ADC development for cancer, which I think a topic, Dr. Len, you might like as well. And then we'll have a talk from 1:35 to 2 from Rachna Mishra, again, talking about the challenges that we face in clinical research throughout COVID-19. And then we'll go to our last networking coffee break at 2. So again, if you haven't had a chance to visit our exhibitors, this is the perfect time to rack up some points and gain some points. 10 points for visiting each booth and collecting the code. Once you have 50 points, you can redeem it for Amazon or Uber Eats gift cards. And so I will transfer now everyone to the networking room. Feel free to explore until 1:05.
Great, thanks, Sam.